emerge within the informal sector, and the role of the state in particular in kind of producing forms of informality across the different sites. So we've got these 7 papers. Hopefully, if people have had a chance to have a look at the material online. Each of these sessions is organized in this format where the 4, so we've got 4 in this first panel, we'll have kind of 2 or 3 minutes to present the kind of key kind of points, key arguments, key provocations within their individual papers and contributions. And then we'll have kind of an open floor for discussion. Ideally, because we're relatively small numbers, we can do that by raising hands, and then I'll kind of point to people as they raise their hands, so we can keep a kind of conversation flow. But if for any reason, technical difficulties or so on, you can't raise your hand, do feel free to write in the chat, and I'll try and read your question out to the panel as well. So I think we'll go then in the order of the panel on the list. And start then with Andreas Admasi and Efrem Shifarur, who are going to talk to us about their work in and on Ethiopia. So Andreas, Efrem, whenever you're ready, over to you.
Thank you very much. So I'll try to share the PowerPoint here. I don't know, can you see it now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, excellent. So very briefly then, myself and Efrem Shifarur, we have been working, well, it's really a preliminary assessment of the type of research that we would like to focus more on in terms of the collective contestation of informal work conditions in Addis Ababa. And we are looking at the case of domestic workers. We are building on, myself, I'm building on research that I've been doing on trade unions in Ethiopia. And Efrem has been doing research on UDLs, which are traditional self-help associations of workers in the formal and informal sectors. And the objectives we set out, of course, these are not questions that we can exclusively answer at this stage, but we aim to look at how informal sector workers then seek to avoid or contest exploitative relations, and domestic workers in the Ethiopian context are some of the most exploited workers. And what collectivities informal workers develop to this end, both in terms of associations more akin to trade unions and self-help associations, as well as informal networks, and then what the relationship between these collectivities and formal sector workers collectivities are, and then also, of course, the relationship to the state. We've been looking a little bit at the size of this sector, and we believe that official estimations are a little bit lower than what is likely. But Ethiopian domestic workers are often also in different stages of migration from rural areas to urban areas, and then often on to Gulf areas, and also eventually some of them also to the global north. And we're also looking there a bit on how these collectivities of domestic workers in Ethiopia are also connecting to their collectivities, particularly across the Red Sea in the Gulf states, where domestic workers have several associations, but they're also joining trade unions, and there's also a relationship between the Ethiopian trade unions and the trade unions in the Gulf states with regards to domestic workers. One peculiarity here that is important to point out is that domestic workers in Ethiopia are not covered by the labor law. They are therefore not allowed to unionize, and that is why they have set up an association at this stage. This association aims to become a basic trade union or an industrial federation in the future, and aims to affiliate with the Confederation of Ethiopian Trade Unions should Ethiopia ratify ILO's Domestic Workers Convention, which is something that both of these organizations are striving towards. And so we using what we have been doing in this preliminary assessment, more than building on our previous research, is that we have also conducted interviews with representatives of the domestic workers associations, the trade unions, and what was at the time the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs. I should not go in too much in depth about what we found here, but it is an association under formation. They have hired organizers that the Confederation of Ethiopian Trade Unions have also helped them with, and they are organizing domestic workers in preparation of first putting pressure on the government and eventually then attempting to form a formal trade union. And the relationship with state institution here too, I shouldn't go too much in depth to this. Suffice to say is that on the lower level, it appears to be relatively cordial. There appears to be some form of sympathy when it comes to the line minister in charge. But of course, this is also, it's very possible that this changes when it reaches the higher echelons of the states and when this interest needs to be balanced against other probably more powerful interests. So although there is now a big campaign both from the Confederation of Trade Unions and the domestic workers associations to ratify the convention, that has not been done yet. So finally, we established some research priorities that we think that would be important to look at going forward with this. And then one is then the obstacles to collective contestation of working conditions, including collective bargaining, that arises from these atomized conditions of individual domestic workers who typically work one or two in a household, probably more often one than two. And then the difference that we also, that some of our interviews have touched upon between, I think it's difficult at this time to assess how many percentage of Addis Abeba's domestic workers are living domestic workers, meaning they live with their employers around the clock, perhaps with allowed for breaks such as going to school and so on, and those who return in the evening to their own households, and how this affects their abilities to organize, because we have noticed some tendency for the Domestic Workers Association to have an easier time organizing the returning domestic workers than the living domestic workers. And this can also, this is of course about control over the time of the workers, but it's also about the paternalistic relations of the employment relationship. And then we would also like to look at this relationship between domestic workers organizations that are emerging in Ethiopia and those in the Gulf, particularly since it's quite often the case that workers from Ethiopia go to the Gulf and also return to Ethiopia. So it's often the same workers. These are not worlds apart. And finally, we would also look at then the formal organization of informal sector workers, then, which is this association, and the informal associations of the workers, which are the UDRs and other forms of network. So that briefly is where we are at this stage. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Andreas. So we'll move on to our next panelist very quickly then. So Maurizio Zeni, joining from Buenos Aires. Just remind Maurizio, if you just a couple of minutes just to kind of pull out a couple of the key bullet points and provocations from the paper that you posted on the portal. So Maurizio, whenever you're ready, over to you.
Yes, I'm ready. Good morning. It's early here, but it's good to start with this interesting panel. Basically, the paper that is in the platform try to set the backgrounds from a point of view of organizations which are operating in the field of informality, of workers' informality. So I've tried to put this in order for you to understand the dynamic from an organizational point of view. Informality is something relatively new for Argentina. Till the middle of the 1970s, Argentina was almost a full employment country with relatively good wages for all workers. So really, informality was something not typical of Argentina compared to other Latin American countries. So the shift to informality increased with the 1990s and the entrance into neoliberalism, which started a little bit earlier from the end of the 1970s, and so it's has been dealt with in the form that traditionally the Argentinian workers took. So basically, in a trade union form. Trade unions are very strong in Argentina for a number of reasons, which you can read more in the paper. So the organization that have started to organize workers on the ground, particularly since the end of the 1990s, have adopted a trade union approach in terms of how to organize workers, even if they were territorial-based organizations. So from that start, in which then the social movement dimension mixed up with the trade union dimension, lots of changes have been produced, especially in the sort of pendular relation these movements have with government in power, particularly with Peronist governments in power. So when we think about the relation between these groups of workers and the states, we have to first consider, well, how the states contribute to the definition of informality. So clearly what we can see now is that the state has sort of relied on the organization by these social movements on the grounds in order to, on the one hand, to provide subsidies that would allow the material reproduction very often of many of these workers, and this was really highlighted with the starting of the pandemic, when 12 million people asked for a cash help, which was provided by the government, revealing actually the real number of people in need, and at the same time is buying in a way the peace, the social peace. And today this is a hot topic in Argentinian politics, because the former president and actually Vice President Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, she said that actually the subsidy should be under state control and not under social movement control. And of course, this opened like a Pandora vase in terms of well, how to deal with informality and how to deal with this important part of the Argentinian population, which is about 50%, which live at the border of the poverty line. So lots of talks about the need to introduce a basic income and how to then move from a subsidy perspective to a basic income perspective. But clearly the state has a role in the way in which informality is shaping society here. And of course, there are different visions. So the one by Cristina Fernandez is that, well, there should be a way to create formal employment. So again, informality is out of informality is the only way is through formal employment. Others accept that the reality is a different one. So particularly, these are the social movements. What it seems that is far from the possibility is that the states influence the way in which informality is producing a different economic model. So lots of the cooperative cooperatives economic production that have been part of the experiences of informal workers are not really supported by the states. Informal workers movement are always asking for states that create a market for their product, for instance, for all things that are recycled, but there's really not an interest in this sense, or maybe the impossibility of the state to really push for a different economic model in the field of informality by using this experience and knowledge produced by workers. So it's an open field with lots of political interest and linkages. and fracture within the movements themselves. What it seems clear to me is that there is an acceptance that the more social movements rely on political alliances, political linkages connected particularly with the Peronist party, with the Peronist movements, they get into a sort of trap in terms of not being able to advance with their own independent policy or political goals, and accepting a sort of secondary role by, of course, being dependent on the states in many ways, immediately with subsidies, but also with also linkages at institutional level, or maybe with the basic income if this is going to happen. So here again, there is more to talk, and it is more about strategies and political action than really just about an analysis of informality on the ground. Unfortunately, one part of the idea of this project was to try to connect this situation to empirical finding from how neighborhoods deal with these informalities, with this informality, and how then this tension translated into the field. But it will be for a later meeting. Thanks.
Sorry, I'm on mute. Thanks a lot, Maurizio. So we'll move on now quickly to Valeria Guarneros Mesa, who will talk about the kind of overarching ideas around the project.
So yes, the aim of the paper, and you can read more about it on the platform, is to build a comparative methodology to identify, understand, and analyze different collective organizing practices of informal workers across Addis Ababa, Buenos Aires, and Bangalore in India. And the paper basically focuses on how we can start building this comparative framework. And the idea is building on debates on relational comparison, that it's a methodology that it's commonly used in urban studies, but not that used under labor studies. So try to bring in those debates on relational comparison. So relational comparison works at two levels. At the first level is the everyday social interlinkages and relational flows. That we are associating that with everyday social infrastructures. And the second level works more on the historical and the geographical relations that can bring together different cities. But also at this more macro level, there are new debates saying that it's not only the historical relations or the geographical relations that we can study, but we can also build conceptual relations and relations around knowledge exchange that interconnect these cities. So we are hoping to build this comparison across these three cities using these relational comparison and its two levels. So the purpose of this paper was, well, to present this comparative framework to the colleagues involved in the project. So that's Andreas, Maurizio, Efrem, and Supriya to gauge your points of view around this comparative framework, but also to the rest of the audience is to explain to you that the drivers of the comparative exercise are relying on three main factors. And the first one is the role of the state in shaping informality. The second is the workers' capacity of organizing and the importance that either trade unions or civil society organization, or the history or legacies of civil society organization, can influence the way workers organize. And then the mobility and flow that workers reproduce in shaping the city. So we are using these three factors as drivers of comparison. And I would would like to hear from the audience whether these drivers make sense. I think, like, just to making a connection with Micaela's colored paper that it's in the next session, I think there are overlaps with the framework that she's trying to build. So it would be also helpful to hear from her what she thinks about this. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Valeria. And then last but not least, we have Nandini Ramamurthy, who's joining us from the Tata Institute of Social Sciences. Nandini, if you've got 2 or 3 minutes just to kind of summarize the key arguments you present in your paper and presentation. Over to you.
Thank you. This article argues that imposing or deferring regulations during the pandemics makes informality robust and causes a shadow effect on the workers. The study provides an elaborate discussion on regulatory and analytical frameworks. Despite it, at the macro level, we witnessed that governance could not regulate hyper-competition and hyper-production to reduce volatility. At the same time, at the macro level, the assessment of informality depends on workers gaining access to labor market institutions, navigating regulatory environments with ease, and how they use their skill to bargain standard employments. In the context of garment industries, informality is a deliberate choice, especially when employers adhere to subcontracting of work and employment. Such a strategy adopted by firms such strategies are generally adopted by firms to gain commercial benefits of fragmentation, and it also allows the buyers and sellers in the global production system to transfer the risk onto the workers. It is imperative to understand that the discussion that takes place, these discussions takes place within the ambit of globalization, and the key to a healthy economy within the globalization is flexibility and deregulation. Therefore, regulation intentionally or not imposes rigidities, and hence the presence of imperfect monitoring and compliances is an optimal situation for firms. The reasons behind why protectionist regulations, that is basically state-led regulations, are they invariably differ because they apply on rigid rules and regulations. They are inflexible, and whenever there is fragmentation of production, it increases the cost of regulation. Other forms of regulations like certification, auditing, and ranking of suppliers' work organization fall under the same protectionist framework. However, they are dysfunctional because they work on the principle of threat, incentive, sanction, fine, and imprisonment. The multi-stakeholder initiative and other similar approaches that are often encouraged, they are not in continuance because they depend on buyers' involvement. Once the buyers withdraw the support, the entire regulatory structure collapses. Thus, it is seen that both forms of regulation and governance do not change the behaviors of the firms or address the root cause of informality to negate the shadow effect on workers. Based on this, it is imperative to look at some alternative strategies that are away from mainstream regulatory frameworks. In this context, I want to highlight the digitalizing of solidarity by using radio stations, wherein it connects the workers and trade unionists and brings both of them together in one platform. And in the process, the workers can voice their struggles without the fear of losing their jobs. Lastly, I would like to add that the digitalization of solidarity can, to a certain extent, address the root cause of informality among the workers.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Nandini. So we'll turn now to some discussion questions. So if anyone has any particular, we've got about 15 minutes, but we can run a little bit into the break because we will be hopping over to the next panel anyway. So if there are any questions or comments that anyone wants to raise, either from the panel themselves or from the audience, please feel free to raise your hand or type anything into the chat. Yeah, Melanie. Thank you.
So nice to see Valeria and colleagues. I was interested in this session for a while, but I couldn't put a paper into it, unfortunately. So it's very interesting to hear about how the project is doing kind of comparative relational research. I had a couple of questions kind of relating to the overarching framework that might also be answered by the different kind of participants. The first was about how economic informality intersects with other forms, especially spatial manifestations of informality. So I wondered, it's a question you posed, are there factors that relate more to kind of spatial informality, for example, tenure, that are shaping these types of economic informality? And conversely, if you're taking a Lefebvrean point of view, if you've got that in your framework, are there forms of organizing that are coming from economic informality that are shaping space? So is there a two-way relationship between, I guess, economic informality and organizing and spatial factors in the different cases? That was the first part of my question. And the second part was just about, in response to Valeria's request for kind of impressions on the framework. I mean, like I say, I really like it. I just wonder if, with the relational comparison, have you thought about relations between social movements as well as places and kind of labor, types of labor? Have you thought about how social movements might kind of interact, especially in the digital age, at a global scale or at least at a regional scale?
Thanks a lot. I think let's go back to the panel then to see. I can maybe start with Valeria and then go to Maurizio, Ephraim, and Nandini if there are any comments to add on. So, yeah, Valeria.
Yes, I think on the first question that Melanie raised, which is very important, I think the other colleagues will be in. Well, it's their field work, so I'll leave them to answer that. I can give examples at the moment on how economic informality intersects with other aspects of informality. Sorry? Oh, I think someone on anyway. But around the second question on relations that might exist across social movements, at the moment we haven't seen that those relations exist. But what we want to do is create a space where social movements in Buenos Aires with Bangalore and Addis Ababa, we create those spaces where activists and politicians come together and then they start exchanging, experiences, points of view, or whatever that is. So the relations will be built during the process. Because at the moment, there aren't any connections between what social movements in Buenos Aires are experiencing with, the Domestic Workers Association in Addis Ababa and the garment industry in Bangalore. So at the moment, those connections don't exist. But I think that those connections could be built through the research we develop.
Thanks, Valeria. Is there, before we go to Michaela, do any of the other panelists want to jump in with any responses to that first question? Yeah, Maurizio.
Thanks for the very useful comment, Melanie. I think the last one you made, so looking at the differences between social movements is really relevant, at least in the reality of Argentina. I've tried to mention it about this fracture and tension existing within the movements, depending on the alignments with which kind of fraction within the Peronist movement. So now there are clearly two main positions following the first one, a sort of more standard approach to informality, a sort of continuation, which is the one that is dependent on the state paying subsidies, and the other one, which has been opened recently by the vice president, which is a political figure, important political figure here, about the need for the states to get back into control of subsidies. So this has opened a Pandora vase, as I said. So I think this relation between movements is very important.
Thanks, Maurizio. So move on now then to Michaela's question, and there's a question in the chat as well. So Michaela.
Hi, thanks very much. I guess I have a question for a couple of speakers, but first, your paper, Valeria and Adam, which I enjoyed a lot and kind of echo some of the comments from Melanie on that. There were so many bits I wanted to talk about, but maybe just for now, again, I really echo the point of interest about linking social movements or linking labor organizing across the cities. And I wonder if there's a kind of methodology or how discovering a mode of linking can be built into the research exercise itself. But also in terms of your drivers, when you talk about the role of the state in shaping informality, I liked some of the kind of concrete historical examples you gave, for instance, from Argentina. You talk about the Peronist influence, but I wonder how you conceptualize that role of the state, and how you might break down the state into different coalitions, or whether you see it as kind of more a historical institutionalist analysis of, you know, legacies, institutional legacies that are affecting present day state action, whether you see it more as a question of understanding political coalitions and the shifting organization of power within the state. I guess I thought that as a driver seems essential, but how might you unpack it? What kind of theory could you use to help frame your analysis of the state? Oh, and I did have a question for Samuel and Ephraim as well. I really enjoyed your paper. I'm looking forward to reading the findings from the research. I was wondering, maybe this is still part of the future research or what's to come, but when this domestic workers association that's emerging, I guess I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about how it's organizing at present. So you note the challenges about the atomization of the workers involved, but is it these traditional self-help groups that are helping bring them together? There's also a link with SETU, with the kind of more formal trade union organizing. And yeah, I was a bit surprised and interested in how the politics of that support. Yeah, I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Great, thank you. So maybe should we go like reverse order to last time? Start with Ephraim and Andreas, then work our way back through the panel. So Ephraim and Andreas, if you respond to that, and then
I can say something on that. So with the Domestic Workers Association in Ethiopia, it is more of a personal experience than a literature review. So the lady who is now currently the president of the association is herself a domestic worker both in Ethiopia and the Gulf states. So from her own personal frustration and personal experience, she was starting, mobilizing friends and colleagues from Ethiopia and the Gulf states to set up some forms of association. So one domestic worker has the responsibility to mobilize other 10 domestic workers. So they started from a small scale, from a network of friends and from a network of, pressure groups. Then they start forming the association. When they start getting the association, getting the legalization in the form of association, then they start getting connected with SETU, the Confederation of Ethiopian Trade Unions, and other civil society organizations like CBM, to get them organized, to get trainings and other facilities. And that connection with SETU and other civil society organizations makes them visible toward the state actors. Then they start working with government authorities, be it Women and Children Office or Social and Labor Affairs, but all these government authorities are supporting them in a form of act of solidarity and humanity than a form of formal relationship, because there is no law in Ethiopia that governs the relationship between domestic workers on the one hand and the government authorities on the other hand. So it is of a personal experience of that lady that triggered this change and contribute to the birth of that association. Then it's through trickle down effect, it multiplies itself and create these associations in the different regions that Ethiopia has.
Thanks, Ephraim. So Valeria, do you want to jump in now? And then I think there's two questions in the chat. So there you go, Valeria, those two questions in the chat, and then we'll try and wrap up the panel after that.
Thank you, Michaela. I think on how we envisage the role of the state, we have considered the historical institutions or the historical path dependencies, to call it one way, but also we are focusing on the bureaucracy. So what is the bureaucracy in the everyday process shaping that strategies or those tactics to either fight informality or use informality as a way of legitimizing the role of the state. And then the other dimension of the state would be its own regulation, which is related to Nandini's paper. No? So the regulation, the policy, the law, and to what extent all these regulatory landscape is either helping to promote or to halt informality. So in terms of theories, we haven't thought of a theory of a state. And this is myself here saying something, but it has not been discussed with the team. It's more about a Gramscian understanding of hegemony or Foucauldian, combined with Foucauldian governmentality. That's what I have in mind, but it's only me saying this. I don't know if the rest agrees.
Thanks, Valeria. So I've got two quick questions in the chat. I'll read them out as a pair and then offer them up to the panel to whoever wants to jump in first. So the first one's from Nimesh. Thanks for the interesting presentations. I wonder if the panelists can reflect on some of the challenges of organising, especially the risk of backlash and retaliation from the state as civil society actors / media pursue solidarity networks in favour of informal workers. And the second from Theo, I wonder whether some more can be said about the relationship between informal associations and the state and how important these associations are in terms of sharing knowledge among members. So two kind of quite related questions there. I mean, I don't, Nandini, if there was anything you wanted to jump in relation first of all, I know you've not had a chance to speak yet, and then I can open up to the rest of the panel as well.
In terms of organizing solidarity and how we can connect to digitalization, if you see the context of Tirupur, Tirupur has been a very has had a very robust industrial relation culture, wherein the industry started in the 1920s and it took off in the 1970s, and it became a part of global exporters from 2000 onwards. From 1920 to 1980s, if you see the culture of the industrial relations that Tirupur has experienced, it has been very robust. There have been many strikes, lockouts, to put forward their voices. They had there was a relationship between the employer and the employee, wherein workers can block the factories, and there have been many strikes which range from 127 days to 180 days, wherein they can put in their struggles, and ultimately employers had to come in and fulfill at least part of their wishes. But with globalization and everything, there is no direct relationship between employer and employee through subcontracting processes and all. And that is where the solidarity has broken off from the 1985 onwards. And with the age of digitalization, especially through using radio stations, the workers are able to voice their opinions, their struggles, based on which they are getting certain kinds of settlements from the companies or the factories. But it is at a very nascent stage. This experiment is at a very nascent stage, but it can be replicated and and can be taken forward in terms of studying how civil society organizations can reduce or reduce volatility for the workers, given the context of a global production system, and how workers can use their voices to settle, not settle, but at least hear their voice and have a certain opinion which has a certain platform for them.
Thanks, Nandini. So we've slightly over time, but I know we're all probably going off to our next session in a moment anyway. Do any of the other panelists want to jump in and respond to these last two questions?
Maybe very briefly, Adam. No?
Yeah.
So in the case of Ethiopia, regarding domestic workers or informal workers in general, the government recognized their very existence, and even one of the line ministry has the policy intention to transform, informal sector to the formal sector. So they don't have the capacity to materialize that. That's one. Second, in terms of relationship, within the lower level of the government structure, of course, they do cooperate in a form of, act of solidarity, because they consider them as vulnerable group. So as a vulnerable group, the government is there to support. But if you go to the higher level of government authority, there is no policy framework that governs the relationship between domestic workers or informal workers on the one hand, and the mandated government authority. So this relationship can be contested at times. At times, you see also element of cooperation in a sense of act of solidarity and humanity than in a form of formal informal relationship.
Thanks, Ephraim. Any final words? I'm sure these conversations can continue into the next session as well, as there's some nice, I think there's some nice overlaps in some of the themes and questions too. So just say a quick or a big thank you to the panelists and to everyone for their questions and discussion, and look forward to seeing you all in about 5 minutes time in the second session of this panel on informality, a way of surviving the informal city. Thanks very much.
Yeah, just to clarify, we have to leave this room and join the new space.
Yeah. So if everyone
Okay.
hops out and hops into the next one,
Yeah.
we'll see you there.
See you soon.
Yeah,
Thank
mate.
you, everyone. Bye.
Bye. Bye.